I was 34 at the time and working as a freelance welder. I didn't really have a fixed schedule, so I often took long drives alone just to clear my head. In early October of 2017, I decided to take a camping trip through Arkansas. I didn't go to the popular parks or campgrounds, though. I liked the more remote spots, the ones you had to find by scanning old maps or satellite images. I preferred being alone in the woods, far away from noise and people. That trip, I ended up near an old, overgrown train line about 20 miles outside of El Dorado. I had seen it on Google Earth, a narrow track hidden by tree cover, no longer in use, running beside a creek and some flat, open forest. I followed a dirt road until it turned to gravel, then eventually faded into packed earth. I kept driving until I couldn't anymore and parked my truck on the side. From there, I hiked for maybe 40 minutes, dragging my pack through brush and bramble until I found the train track. It was rusted out, bent in places, and completely swallowed by weeds. I figured it had been abandoned for decades, but I liked how it looked, quiet, forgotten. The woods around it weren't thick, but they were wide open and full of those soft autumn colors that made everything feel calm. I walked down the track about half a mile and found a small clearing where the brush had thinned out. There was just enough flat ground to pitch my one-man tent. I didn't bring much, just some canned food, a sleeping bag, a water bottle, and a headlamp. I gathered some dry sticks for a small fire but didn't light it right away. I sat for a while on a flat stone near the tracks and just listened. It was silent, but not in a bad way. Just a low, still kind of quiet. The kind where your ears start picking up things they usually ignore. Leaves brushing together, a bird hopping on a branch, your own breath. As the sun dropped behind the trees, I finally made a small fire and heated up one of my cans. It was a thick stew that steamed into the cold air. I wasn't even that hungry, but it felt good to eat something warm. After I finished, I sat back against a log and watched the flames dance. I remember thinking that it was one of the better solo trips I'd taken. Simple, peaceful, clean air. That night, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and pulled my jacket over my face to keep my nose warm. I remember checking my watch before I drifted off. It was just past 10:30 p.m. sometime during the night. I woke up. I couldn't tell what time it was, but the air had gone colder and I felt stiff. At first, I thought it was just my body adjusting. I shifted inside the sleeping bag and tried to roll over, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't say what it was at first, just that kind of unease that comes for no reason. Then I realized the forest was completely quiet. I know how that sounds. People say it in movies and stories all the time like it's some kind of cliche. But when you've been out there enough, you know what natural silence feels like. You know the difference between quiet and dead quiet. No wind, no leaves moving, no bugs, no owls, no frogs. Just flat air. That's what it was. I stayed in my sleeping bag, not moving. I told myself maybe an animal was nearby and everything had frozen in response. That happens. But still, something felt different. I unzipped the bag slowly and slid my arms out. I grabbed my headlamp from where it hung by the roof of the tent and clicked it on. It worked fine, so I unzipped the flap and peeked outside. The beam of light hit the trees. Everything looked the same. My fire had died out, just a pile of warm ash now. The train track looked as useless and empty as before. But then I noticed something odd. The weeds next to the track had been flattened down. Not like wind or animals had moved through them, but like someone had walked along the side of the track, pushing the grass down with heavy boots. I thought maybe I'd done that earlier without noticing, so I stepped outside the tent to get a better look. The flattened grass went both ways along the track. Long, narrow steps, each one distinct. I followed the prints for maybe 10 feet, then stopped. There was something else. On the rail itself, on the old rusted steel, I saw fresh scratches. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. Raw metal showed beneath the rust. Someone had dragged something sharp along the side. It didn't look like an accident. It looked intentional, like a long line carved slowly along the track. I touched the cut with my finger and felt the edge, still a little warm, somehow. That made my stomach twist. There was no reason for it to be warm. I backed away and turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods with my headlamp. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow felt too still. That was when I noticed my truck keys were no longer clipped to my belt loop. I had clipped them there before crawling into the tent. I remembered the sound of the metal clicking against the buckle. I dropped to my knees and checked the ground, thinking they might have fallen off in my sleep or slipped out when I stepped out of the tent. Nothing. I checked inside the tent. Nothing. Panic started to creep in, slow and sharp. If my keys were gone, someone had to be out there. There was no other reason for them to be missing. I never misplaced them. I don't drink. I don't mess around. I'm careful about my gear. I killed the headlamp for a second and crouched low. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I listened. That's when I heard it. A faint click, like metal tapping metal. Once, then again, slow and deliberate. It was coming from further down the track, where the weeds were thickest. I stayed frozen. The clicking stopped. Then I saw a shape too tall for comfort. It was standing completely still beside the track. I only saw it because of the way the moonlight bent behind it. No movement, just standing there maybe 20 yards away. It was facing me. I knew it was. I felt it in the base of my neck. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and took off through the woods, away from the tracks. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't stop to grab the tent or my food or anything else. I just ran, pushing through the trees and thorns, trying to stay in a straight line toward where I thought the road was. My boots were loud on the leaves, and every crack of a branch made my heart pound harder. I ran for what felt like 20 minutes before I saw the faint glint of my truck's side mirror through the trees. I rushed up to it and pulled the door handle. Locked, of course. The keys were gone. I checked the bed of the truck, then the roof. Nothing. Then I noticed something that made my chest go cold. There was a fresh mark in the dirt by the driver's side. A footprint, big, booted, with deep tread. I turned slowly and looked down the road, back toward the woods. Nothing followed me, but I knew someone had gotten there first. I broke the passenger window with a rock, climbed in, and hot-wired the truck. Took a while, longer than it should have. I cut my hand on glass and was sweating like crazy, but I got it running. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up and I was halfway to Little Rock. I never went back for my gear. I don't camp off-grid anymore. Not since that night. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office about the stolen keys, just to cover myself, but I left out the rest. I knew how it would sound. I don't know who or what was out there, but it was real. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a person. A man, maybe. Someone who knew the woods, who knew how to stay quiet, who knew how to move fast and leave just enough trace to make sure I saw it. The scariest part? He didn't try to hurt me. He didn't chase me or threaten me. He just made sure I knew he was there. That was enough. And I think that was the point. It was the summer of 2016. I was 32 at the time, living alone in a small flat in Nottingham, England. I had gotten into this habit of taking solo camping trips when work became too heavy. Being outdoors helped me clear my head. I didn't have many close friends, and honestly, I preferred it that way. I liked being alone with my own thoughts, away from traffic, screens, and people. No phone service, no noise, no expectations. Just me, a tent, a fire, and some quiet. That August, I decided to camp somewhere different. I'd seen an online forum thread a few months earlier talking about old industrial sites in the Midlands that were left to rot. Someone posted photos of a half-collapsed train maintenance depot deep in the woods outside Shropshire. No real trail, barely any sign that people had visited in years. The pictures stuck with me. Walls choked in ivy, rusted-out boxcars half swallowed by trees, nature slowly eating away the edges of something man-made. I screenshotted the coordinates and saved them. A few weeks later, when things at work got too much, I packed up my gear, loaded my rucksack, and took a Friday off. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't feel the need to. I wasn't doing anything risky. I had my compass, a solar-powered battery, dry food, 2 liters of water, and my tent. I also brought a first aid kit, a fold-out knife, and a torch with spare batteries. I always double-checked my kit. I left at dawn. Took me most of the afternoon to hike in. The woods were dense, and the air got still the deeper I went. The trees grew thick over the old path, and I could tell by the lack of prints or broken branches that this wasn't a place people came to often. By the time I reached the edge of the depot, the sun was low. I remember the feeling of the temperature dropping sharply, like the place held onto cold air longer than the forest around it. It wasn't freezing, but it was uncomfortable, enough to make me glad I brought thermal clothes. The place was bigger than I expected. A long, broken concrete strip ran through the trees like an old spine, ending at a massive metal structure that had lost most of its roof. There were abandoned storage sheds, a tipped-over water tower, and the skeletal remains of a few train cars. All of it was rusted, broken, and half-buried in vines. Some of the trees nearby were cracked and growing sideways, like the ground had shifted years ago and they never recovered. I found a flat patch of ground about 30 meters from the main depot building and set up my tent facing it. It gave me a clear view, which I preferred. I liked seeing what was around me. I made a small fire pit from broken bricks and heated up a tin of beans while listening to the wind moving through the hollow shell of the depot. It made strange echoes, like it caught the wind and bent it, but nothing felt wrong. Not yet. I ate, cleaned up, zipped myself into the tent, and read for a while under the torchlight before eventually falling asleep. I woke up once around 2 a.m., not from a noise, just from the cold. I'd forgotten to fully close the ventilation flap, and a sharp gust cut straight through my sleeping bag. I zipped everything up tight and settled back down, but I remember staring at the ceiling of the tent for a long while. Something about the stillness of the place didn't sit right. Usually, even in remote areas, you'd hear owls or wind or twigs snapping under small animals. But it was quiet. Not dead quiet, just unnatural. I chalked it up to nerves and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out into a heavy fog. I could barely see more than 10 or 15 feet ahead. The forest looked strange in that kind of light. All outlines and no detail. The depot, half visible through the mist, looked like the hull of a shipwreck. I boiled water for tea and sat near the fire pit. Something about the place was starting to feel different. Not haunted, not mystical, just watched, like the way animals freeze when they sense a predator nearby. Still, I told myself it was just my brain playing tricks. That's what happens when you spend too long alone. You get inside your own head too deep. Around midday, the fog lifted a bit, and I started walking through the remains of the depot. I kept to the open areas. Most of the buildings were unsafe, wooden beams sagging, metal stairwells rusted through. I climbed up onto the edge of a collapsed rail car and looked inside. Nothing but rotted crates and some broken equipment. Everything was falling apart, untouched for what looked like decades. But as I was coming down, I noticed something. Path in the weeds. Not a game trail, not wind movement, actual foot movement. Long grass laid flat in a faint line stretching from behind one of the sheds into the trees. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was old, that animals had done it. But the grass wasn't dry or faded. It looked fresh, recently walked on, and there was a faint chemical smell, like engine oil or fuel, even though there shouldn't have been anything like that left in this place. I followed the trail a little ways, staying low. It didn't go far, just curved behind the collapsed wall of a storage building and ended at a hole in the ground. Not a natural hole. It looked like someone had dug it by hand. 2 feet across, maybe 5 or 6 feet deep, and covered by an old wooden pallet that had been shifted recently. There were bits of cloth and some kind of plastic tarp down inside it. I couldn't tell what it was meant for. I didn't climb in. Something in my gut told me not to. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with the knife next to me and the torch in my hand, listening. I thought I heard something around 3 a.m., the sound of soft crunching. Not fast, not loud, just slow steps, something stepping over dead leaves. They came from the direction of the woods and paused right near the fire pit. Then nothing.
No retreat.
No sound of walking away, just stopped. I waited for maybe an hour, not moving, barely breathing. Then I heard a soft scrape, metal against metal, like something brushing the edge of one of the train cars. My hands were shaking. I don't scare easy, but this wasn't fear from imagination. This was different. I kept waiting for some kind of reveal, for a flashlight beam, for a voice, for a sign that it was just a person. But there was none. By dawn, I came out of the tent and looked around. There were no prints, nothing out of place, but my fire pit had been disturbed. The stones had been rearranged. One was stacked neatly on top of another, almost like someone had deliberately made a small tower out of it. That wasn't me. I don't do things like that. I don't leave signs. I pack in and pack out. Always. I didn't eat. I packed my gear fast and didn't even fold the tent properly. I shoved everything into my rucksack and left. I followed my own GPS trail back out through the forest without stopping. Not to drink, not to rest. I made it to the road by late afternoon and flagged down a truck. I didn't say anything to the driver other than where I needed to go. When I got home, I deleted the coordinates and the photos. I've never gone back. It's been years, and I still don't know what I walked into out there. There were no signs of squatters, no real shelter, no food wrappers, no trash. Just that trail, that hole, and the sound of something or someone moving slowly around my camp in the dark. Something that didn't run, didn't speak, and didn't leave a single trace except for the rearranged stones. People always say the woods are empty, that nature doesn't care. But that place, it wasn't empty. Something was using it, living in it, or maybe just watching it, watching anyone who stepped inside it. And I don't think I was the first. I was 33 the summer I decided to drive across a few states and spend a week alone in the mountains of eastern Oregon. I'd taken time off work and wanted to clear my head after a long, ugly divorce that left my life scattered in every direction. I packed up my gear, loaded the cooler with food and water, and pointed my truck toward the Ochoco National Forest. I'd heard it was quiet out there, with fewer tourists than places like the Rockies or Yosemite. That was exactly what I wanted. Silence. No one around me, just trees, wind, and my own thoughts. I reached a clearing on the third day of the drive, a spot a few miles down a gravel forestry road. It wasn't on any map, just a turnoff with some tire marks that faded into overgrown grass. I followed it, crawled along slowly for about 15 minutes, and came to a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. Felt hidden, tucked away. I didn't see or hear anyone else. No traffic, no people, no cell signal. That first day was calm. I set up my tent a few yards from a thin stream that ran past the tree line. It was cold and clear and made a soft bubbling noise that helped me sleep. I cooked on my little camp stove, read some pages of a book, and went to bed early. The weather was perfect. It was everything I had hoped for. The second day, I went hiking up a ridge behind the campsite. The trees were thick, and sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I saw deer tracks, heard an owl even though it was still daytime, and found a rusted old fence post deep in the woods. It looked like someone had once tried to mark that land a long time ago, but now it was just swallowed up by the forest. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up to small noises outside the tent. Branches snapping, something shifting through the leaves. I told myself it was deer or raccoons. Probably nothing. I didn't get out of the tent to check. I didn't want to scare myself over nothing, but the sound kept coming back every hour or so, like something was pacing just beyond the edge of my camp. I stayed still and listened until I fell asleep again. The third day, I noticed something strange. About 100 yards north of the clearing, just past the creek, there was a small patch of ground where the pine needles had been cleared in a perfect circle. At first I thought it was a dried up fire pit, but there were no rocks, no ashes, no sign of burning. Just a smooth, dirt circle about 6 feet across. Too neat to be natural. It looked like it had been swept clean. I didn't like the look of it. I told myself it was probably nothing and walked away. I didn't go hiking that day. I stayed near the camp, kept a small fire going, and tried to enjoy the peace. But it was harder now. I felt like something was off. I couldn't name it, but the woods felt heavier, like I wasn't alone. That night, I went to bed early again, but just before I zipped the tent shut, I heard something out in the trees. Not an animal this time. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Then silence. Then another slow step. It wasn't close, maybe 20 or 30 yards out, but it was steady. Not running, not moving fast, just walking around out there. I turned off my lantern and stayed completely still inside the tent. I had my knife beside me, and I held it tight. I couldn't see anything, but I listened for nearly an hour. The footsteps would stop, then start again somewhere else. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther. But they didn't leave. Eventually, everything went quiet again. No wind, no insects, just the blood in my ears and my own breathing. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I looked around the campsite. No tracks, no sign of anyone. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction I thought I'd heard the footsteps, but the ground was too dry and hard to show prints. I circled back around and found something that made my stomach twist. A pile of stacked rocks, carefully balanced in a cone shape, had been placed just outside my tent. It wasn't there the night before. It was fresh. Small rocks, stacked with precision, about 10 inches high. Nothing natural about it. I didn't touch it. I just stood there staring at it. I didn't know what it meant or who did it, but it was enough for me. I packed up camp fast and loaded everything into the truck. I didn't drive out right away, though. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, trying to decide what to do. The road back was narrow and rough. If someone had followed me in, they could have easily blocked it or done something to the truck. I was deep in the woods, probably 15 or 20 miles from the nearest ranger station, and with no signal. I had to take it slow and smart. As I pulled onto the forestry road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw someone standing at the edge of the clearing, far back, just past the trees. They weren't moving, just standing still and watching. I pressed the gas and didn't look again. The road out felt longer than I remembered. Every branch scrape on the side of the truck made me jump. Every shadow between the trees looked like it could move. I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see a vehicle or something behind me, but there was nothing. When I finally reached the main gravel road that led back to the highway, I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I drove for hours until I reached a small town near Burns, Oregon. I checked into a motel and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep much that night either. The next morning, I drove straight home to Idaho. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I even say? I wasn't hurt. Nothing happened, technically, but it shook me more than I expected. About a week later, I decided to check satellite maps of the area where I had camped. Just curiosity. I traced the forestry road and the creek. I found the clearing. But what made my heart sink was what I saw about 200 yards north of where I had been. The structure. A roof, hidden in the trees. I zoomed in, but the resolution was poor. Still, it was clear enough to see it wasn't a ranger cabin or an old shed. It was long, with a metal roof. No road leading to it. Just deep in the woods, hidden. I looked around online, tried to find any info about it. Land ownership records, old maps, forums. Nothing. Not even a mention of that structure existing. Just empty land on paper. I never went back to check. I never will. To this day, I don't know if I camped near someone's secret property or if I stumbled into something else entirely. Maybe it was just some old off-grid cabin. Maybe the footsteps and the rocks were warnings. Maybe the person watching me was just making sure I left. Or maybe they were waiting to see what I'd do next. But I think if I hadn't left that morning, if I had stayed just one more night, things would have ended very differently. I've gone camping a few times since then, but never alone. Never that deep. Never again in eastern Oregon. Some places aren't meant to be found, even by accident. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the Northumberland countryside. I was 34 then, working an office job in Leeds that drained the life out of me. I hadn't taken a proper break-in over a year, and the pressure was stacking up in my head. I'd always found peace in the quiet. Fields, trees, no phone signal, no city noise, just the wind and my own thoughts. I packed my small tent, sleeping bag, gas stove, and a few cans of food, and I drove north until I hit a patch of land between Rothbury and a little village called Thropton. I'd read somewhere online that it was good for wild camping, and there wasn't much foot traffic, which suited me perfectly. I parked the car by the side of a gravel road and hiked about a mile into the woods, following an old sheep trail that led to a clearing near a stream. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's pressing against your ears. There were old stone walls in the area, covered in moss, probably from some ancient farmland. I set up the tent on a slight slope, pitched it tight, laid out my sleeping mat, and built a small fire with some dry branches I collected around the edge of the clearing. By late evening, I was sitting by the fire with a tin of beans warming up on the little stove. The sky had turned deep gray, with only slivers of orange light sneaking through the low clouds. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. I could hear the stream trickling nearby and nothing else. Not even birds. It wasn't windy, just that still kind of air that makes you feel like time's frozen. I didn't think much of it then. I just assumed it was a calm patch of weather. After eating, I walked a short loop through the woods to stretch my legs before bed. There was an overgrown path leading to an old stone bridge further upstream. The bridge looked like it hadn't been used in decades, cracked and covered in weeds. On the way back, I spotted a figure standing at the edge of the tree line near my camp. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump or the shape of a rock. But when I looked again, it was clear. Someone was there. A woman. She was standing completely still, about 20 meters away, half hidden by a few thin birch trees. Her clothes didn't make sense. She wore what looked like an old, faded brown coat that hung down to her ankles. It reminded me of something from the 1960s or 70s, wool or tweed, something too heavy for summer. Her hair was black and long, hanging flat against her shoulders, and even though her face was partly in shadow, I could see she was pale, too pale. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, frozen, staring at her. She didn't move, didn't turn her head, nothing. I backed up slowly, not taking my eyes off her, and went straight into my tent. I zipped it shut, crawled into my sleeping bag fully clothed, and stayed there, listening. But there was nothing. No crunching leaves, no snapping twigs. Just the stream and my own heart pounding in my ears. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, or at least what I could make out of it. It wasn't just pale. It looked wrong, like her skin didn't have the right texture, like she wasn't meant to be outside. I told myself in the morning I'd just pack up and leave. Probably just some local woman walking her dog. Maybe she lived nearby and I'd accidentally set up camp on her land. That's what I kept telling myself. When daylight came, I got up and stepped outside. There was no sign of her. No footprints, nothing disturbed. I made a quick breakfast, packed up, and decided to follow the trail past the stone bridge, just to see where it went. I figured I'd loop around and get back to the car from a different direction. I don't know why I didn't just head back the way I came. Maybe I didn't want to pass that same spot again. I walked for over an hour, and the trail thinned until it was barely visible. I was relying more on the slope of the land than any actual path. That's when I noticed something odd. Bits of wool caught on thorns, old pieces of fencing half buried in the soil. And then I came across a narrow path that looked like it had been cut recently. Neatly trimmed branches, fresh footprints in the mud. It led to an old stone building, half collapsed, maybe an old barn or shepherd's hut. The roof was mostly caved in, but the doorway was intact. The door wasn't fully closed. It was slightly open, just enough to see the edge of something inside. I should have turned back, but I stepped closer. Inside, there was a mattress on the floor, torn and stained. Piles of clothes stacked against the far wall. Women's clothes, coats, scarves, old shoes, all moldy and damp. I could see jars too. Dozens of them lined up along one wall, filled with something cloudy. I didn't look too closely. That's when I saw the coat. The same brown coat I'd seen the woman wearing, hanging from a nail on the wall. It was unmistakable, the color, the cut, everything. My mouth went dry. I backed out slowly and walked fast in the opposite direction, not even caring which way I was going anymore. I just wanted to put distance between me and that place. I must have walked for hours. Eventually, I crossed another stream and hit a fence line that led me back to a road. I followed the road back to where I'd parked. The car was untouched, but something didn't feel right. I kept checking over my shoulder like someone was behind me. Every sound in the woods made me flinch. I drove straight back to Leeds that evening. I didn't stop once, not even for food. When I got home, I dumped all my camping gear in the garage and didn't touch it for over a year. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman, or that coat, or the jars in that hut. A few weeks later, I tried to find the spot again on Google Maps. I zoomed into the area between Rothbury and Thropton, but the trail I followed wasn't there. The hut wasn't marked. I checked forums, old maps, anything I could find. Nothing. It was like the path didn't exist. I told myself it was just an old squatter site, maybe someone mentally ill living off-grid. But I never saw her move. I never heard her walk, just standing there watching. It wasn't natural. Not in a supernatural way, just in a deeply wrong kind of way. Like she didn't belong out there or anywhere. I've been camping since, but only in groups. Never alone again. And never in that part of the country. Sometimes I think I should have reported it to someone. But what would I say? That I saw a woman standing still in the woods? That I found a coat and some jars in an old hut? There wasn't a crime, just a feeling. A deep, cold feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, and that someone or something was watching. Now, every time I see someone standing still for too long, even in the city, I remember that woman, the coat, the silence, and I wonder if anyone else has seen her. I was 27 the summer I decided to camp alone in an old graveyard just outside of a tiny village in Wales called Glanaber. It was the kind of place most people only drove through, a patch of gray stone cottages surrounded by endless green hills and narrow, crumbling roads. The year was 2017, and I had taken 2 weeks off work to hike across parts of the country with nothing but a pack, my tent, and my camera. I'd been camping in woods, open fields, and once on a sheep farm, but when I came across the old graveyard on the edge of Glanaber, something about it drew me in. It wasn't big, just a few dozen headstones, most of them broken or leaning, covered in moss and choked by tall grass. There were no gates, just a low stone wall that was more decorative than anything else, and the whole place backed up against a thick copse of trees. It didn't feel spooky or haunted, it just felt forgotten. I knew I shouldn't. I even told myself I'd keep walking, but something about how quiet it was made me slow down. I climbed over the low wall and walked between the rows of graves. The ground was soft and damp from rain the day before, and my boots squished with each step. Most of the dates on the headstones were worn away, but I could make out some from the 1800s. One still had a little stone lamb carved into the top. It was peaceful in a strange way. No one had visited this place in years, maybe decades. I pitched my small tent near the far edge of the graveyard, under a big, twisted oak tree. The roots pushed up through the earth, and I had to clear some branches and rocks before staking the tent down. I set up my small camp stove, boiled some water for tea, and ate a cold dinner out of a tin. The sky was already turning gray again, the clouds thick and low. I checked the weather on my phone. Light rain overnight, nothing serious. By the time I zipped myself into the tent, the drizzle had already started. The sound of raindrops tapping the nylon was steady, and I lay there for a long time just listening to it. I had no cell service, which wasn't a surprise, and I hadn't seen another person for hours. There were no dogs barking, no traffic humming in the distance, just the wind brushing the trees and the occasional cry of a bird overhead. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, it was fully dark. I couldn't see the tent walls, just black. The rain was louder now, and the wind had picked up. Branches creaked above me, and the wet canvas of the tent pulsed slightly with each gust. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. Everything inside was the same. Sleeping bag, backpack, my muddy boots lined up by the flap. Then I heard it, a dull scraping sound, like metal dragging slowly across stone. I froze. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It was out there somewhere, beyond the tent, in the rain and dark. I held my breath, trying to make out where it was coming from. It stopped for a second, then started again, soft and slow, like something being pushed or pulled across the wet ground. I clicked off the flashlight and listened harder. The sound was moving, not in a straight line, but slowly weaving through the graveyard. I knew what it could be, maybe a deer rubbing against something metal, or an old gate swinging in the wind. But there were no gates. I had walked the perimeter. The only metal I'd seen was rusted fence posts in the woods behind me. I lay there still, barely breathing. The scraping stopped. Then I heard a single thump. Not sharp, more like a heavy footfall hitting wet grass. Then another, closer this time. I sat up slowly, reached for the small knife I kept in my pack, and held it tight. The tent walls rippled slightly with the wind, and water dripped from the seams. I thought about unzipping the flap and peeking out, but I couldn't make myself do it. Instead, I waited. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. Just the rain, just the wind. No more sounds. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe something had shifted in the storm. I forced myself to lie back down, closed my eyes, and tried to control my breathing. Sometime later, I heard footsteps. Clear, steady, deliberate. Not from an animal. Not stumbling, not darting. Heavy and slow, walking right along the outside of my tent. The sound of shoes in mud. I opened my eyes, but I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps circled halfway around, then stopped directly behind me where my head was. I felt the weight of whoever it was through the ground, a solid pressure behind me. The tent fabric didn't move, but I swear I could sense the presence, close and watching, just standing there. I didn't move for over an hour. I know that because my watch buzzed from my wrist when it turned past 3. I stayed like that, muscles tense and cramped, heart hammering, until the rain lightened and the first pale light started to bleed into the sky. By the time I unzipped the tent and stepped out, everything was quiet again. The graveyard looked peaceful. The grass was soaked, the stones shining with rainwater. I looked around the tent, expecting to see prints, marks, anything. Nothing. But behind the tent, just 3 feet from where I had been lying, was a small patch of flattened grass, in a shape that looked like someone had stood there for a very long time. The soil was packed down deep, and I saw what looked like the partial heel of a boot print pressed into the edge. I packed up fast. Didn't eat, didn't make tea. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't want to turn my back on anything. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to step out from behind a headstone. But no one ever did. When I climbed over the wall and back onto the road, I didn't stop walking until I was a mile out of Glanaber. I didn't tell anyone when I got back. I deleted the photos I had taken in the graveyard. I don't know why. Maybe I felt like keeping any record of that place was inviting something to follow me. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe someone was living rough in the woods. Maybe it was just bad timing. A traveler or local passing through who decided to stop and watch some idiot camping in a graveyard. But I've thought about it for years now, and nothing explains the way that person, if it was a person, moved, or why they stood behind my tent, not saying anything, not doing anything, just standing. I haven't camped alone since. Not in a graveyard. Not anywhere. I still hike, still take my camera out. But when the sun starts to drop, I make sure I've got 4 walls and a locked door around me. I don't care how safe the place looks, because out there, in places people forget, you realize that the scariest thing isn't a ghost or monster. It's someone watching you in the dark and choosing not to leave. It was in late October of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in a quiet part of Western Oregon. I had just turned 34, and things weren't going great for me at the time. I had lost my job 2 months earlier, and everything felt like it was falling apart. I needed space. I needed to be alone for a few days to think without anyone bothering me. That's why I chose a spot deep in the woods near an old logging road that most people didn't even know existed. It wasn't a marked campground or anything official. I found it on an old online forum where a guy mentioned this clearing next to a small creek, tucked about 8 miles off the main road, and how it was the quietest place he'd ever been. I borrowed my cousin's old truck, packed up my tent, sleeping bag, and a week's worth of food, and made the drive early on a Tuesday morning. The air smelled like damp pine the moment I rolled down the windows. The road leading up to the spot was muddy and narrow, winding between thick trees that felt like they were closing in the deeper I went. When I finally reached the clearing, it was everything I had hoped for. No other cars, no noise, just the steady sound of the stream and the breeze moving through the trees. I set up my tent just before the first bit of rain started. Nothing heavy, just light drops tapping the top of the canvas while I fixed myself a quick meal and unrolled my sleeping bag inside. The ground was soft from earlier rain, but not flooded, and I had a small tarp under the tent that helped keep it dry. The first night passed quietly. I fell asleep to the sound of rain and woke up early to the sound of birds and the faint rustle of trees. I spent the day walking around, exploring a few animal trails, and even found an old moss-covered structure that looked like it might have been part of an old logging setup. Rusted metal and rotting wood, mostly caved in. I didn't go inside, just walked around it and took a few photos. It felt like a place time forgot, and I was fine leaving it that way. The second night was when the weather turned worse. Around 6 in the evening, thick clouds rolled in fast. The wind picked up, and soon the rain was falling harder than it had all day. I cooked inside the tent using a small gas burner, careful not to tip it. I had my headlamp on, and outside the light, everything was pitch black. The rain hitting the canvas was so loud I could barely hear anything else. That's probably why I didn't notice at first what I thought later might have been movement outside. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. The rain was still pounding, and the wind pushed hard against the side of the tent. But I had that feeling in my chest. Something was off. My breath was shallow. I didn't hear anything specific, but it was like a switch had flipped inside me, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. That strange gut feeling. I stayed still and just listened. The tent walls rippled with wind, and water ran down the sides in sheets. I turned off my headlamp and sat in the dark for a few minutes, letting my eyes adjust. I pressed my ear close to the fabric on one side and waited. Then I heard it. Not the rain, not the wind. It was the sound of something or someone, stepping through wet ground, slow and deliberate. It wasn't an animal. I've heard raccoons, deer, and even coyotes before, and they move differently. This sounded like 2 feet, human steps. I froze completely. I didn't know if I should call out or just stay silent, so I did nothing. I reached quietly for the hatchet I kept near my sleeping bag and gripped it tightly, heart racing. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Then I heard them again. A few steps to the left, behind the tent now. Still slow, still heavy. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. No campsites nearby. No trail access. I hadn't seen another car in miles. The idea that someone else would be walking around in that kind of storm, in the dark, that deep into the woods, didn't sit right. It made no sense. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. The footsteps eventually faded into the rain. I couldn't tell if they'd stopped or just gotten too far away to hear over the storm. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. Every small gust of wind brushing against the side of the tent made my heart pound. I was sweating under the sleeping bag despite the cold. When dawn came, I waited until the light was strong enough before I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Everything was soaked, and the fog clung to the trees in thick strips. I walked the perimeter of the camp slowly, scanning the mud for any prints. That's when I saw them. On the far side of the tent, maybe 5 feet away, were clear tracks, boot prints. Not huge ones, maybe size 10, but they were deep and the stride matched a slow walk. They stopped close to the tent wall, then turned and disappeared back into the woods. There were no other tracks around. No prints leading in from the road. Just the set that circled me and left. That meant the person had come through the trees. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even take down the tarp properly. I just stuffed it all into the truck and peeled out of there, tires spinning in the mud. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I didn't even feel safe then, not really. My hands were shaking, and my stomach was tight the entire drive back. I didn't report it. What would I have said? That someone walked near my tent? That I heard footsteps and found tracks? No crime had been committed, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt. That wasn't someone hiking through. That wasn't someone lost. That was someone who came there during a storm at night without a light and stood just a few feet away from where I slept. They never said anything, never knocked, never tried to get in. They just watched. After that, I didn't go camping alone again. Not because I was scared of the woods or animals or even the dark. I was scared of people, of the things they do quietly, of the fact that someone might go deep into a forest during a storm just to stand outside a stranger's tent in silence. That thought has stayed with me ever since. It was the summer of 2016 when I took a solo camping trip deep into the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. I had just turned 31 a few months before and had finally saved enough to take a break from work. My job back in Denver was eating me alive, and I needed to get away. I wasn't after peace or some kind of spiritual escape. I just wanted space, clean air, silence, and no one around me. I picked a spot I had only heard about from an older guy I met at a bait shop, some off-the-grid clearing near an old fire watchtower that hadn't been used in decades. The place wasn't listed in any guidebooks, and I liked that. No trails, no campsites, nothing but game tracks and deep forest. I had to park my truck on a dirt road and hike nearly 4 miles in with all my gear. The weather was dry, the sun was strong, and the trees were thick with that dense summer scent, pine, dust, and earth. I pitched my tent in a clearing just wide enough to get some light, surrounded on all sides by tall trees and heavy undergrowth. No phone signal, no noise, not even the hum of an airplane. It was perfect. The first day went smoothly. I hiked, made a fire, cooked some beans and jerky, and sat by the flames until late. The silence was heavy but comforting. The only sounds were the occasional crack of branches far off or the soft flutter of moths around the fire. I slept easily that first night. On the second day, I decided to explore the area more. I followed some animal trails, went uphill toward the ridge, and tried to find a good vantage point. The forest was deep and tangled, and at times I had to push through thorny underbrush and fallen branches. I remember noticing how quiet it was, almost too quiet. No birdsong, no squirrels running through the leaves, just stillness. I brushed it off. Maybe the animals had moved deeper due to the heat. Around late afternoon, I came across something strange. There was a narrow game trail that looked more like a path worn down by something big. Not deer, something heavier. It wasn't just the width that caught my attention. It was how the trail cut unnaturally straight through the trees. I followed it for maybe 15 minutes before I found the remains of what looked like an old camp. A rusted tin can, scraps of tarp, a pair of broken sunglasses. Everything was sun-bleached and old, probably years since anyone had been there. But what really unsettled me was the pile of bones near the tree line. Not human, I told myself, probably elk or deer, but they were scattered strangely, and some had clear knife marks on them. Not the kind from a hunter who was processing meat. These looked rough, almost frantic. That night, I felt different. I couldn't explain it. I didn't hear anything unusual at first, but there was a pressure in the air, like something was watching me from just beyond the tree line. My fire crackled loud in the silence, and every shadow seemed to move in ways that didn't feel right. At one point, I thought I heard someone walking near my tent. Heavy steps, slow and deliberate, but when I stepped out with my flashlight, nothing was there, just trees and the quiet. I barely slept. On the third day, I hiked back toward the old camp, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to prove to myself there was nothing wrong. It was just some old forgotten place. But when I reached the spot, the bones were gone. All of them, completely cleared. No sign of scattering, no drag marks. Nothing. That hit me harder than I expected. Bones don't just disappear. I looked around for any signs, paw prints, claw marks, anything. I found a few broken branches heading deeper into the woods, so I followed. I shouldn't have. About half a mile in, I came across a clearing. And in the center, I saw something I still struggle to describe. A tall figure, too tall to be normal, crouched low, its back to me. It looked human, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms were long, too long, and its shoulders were hunched in a way that didn't look natural. It wasn't doing anything, just crouched, almost like it was listening. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a few seconds, it stood, slowly. Not startled, not panicked, just slow and smooth. It turned its head slightly toward me, not fully, and I saw its profile. It was like a man's face, but stretched, slack, pale, and long like something wearing skin that didn't fit right. I stepped back, careful not to break a branch. But I did. A single snap under my boot. Turned fully then. I ran. I didn't care about direction, didn't think about the trail. I tore through the brush, arms scratched and legs burning. I ran until I collapsed in a ditch, breathing hard, heart thumping in my ears. I stayed there for an hour, maybe longer. When I finally had the strength, I made my way back toward camp, using my GPS as best I could. When I got back, my tent was ripped open. Not slashed, ripped. My gear was thrown around. My food was gone. Not eaten, just gone. My flashlight was crushed like someone had stepped on it with full force. My boots were missing, and right in the center of the clearing, there was something that made my stomach turn. A dead rabbit, fresh, gutted and placed neatly on top of my sleeping bag. I didn't stay. I packed what I could in less than 5 minutes. Left the rest. I hiked in my socks for miles until I reached the truck. By the time I got there, it was nearly dark, and I didn't stop driving until I hit the first gas station hours later. I didn't talk to anyone. I just drove all the way back to Denver that night. I didn't tell anyone about it for months. When I did, I didn't call it anything. I just said I saw something in the woods, something I couldn't explain. People tried to say it was a bear, maybe someone messing with me. But bears don't leave rabbit guts in your tent, and no one hikes that deep into nowhere to screw with strangers. I later read about stories from that area. Old stories from the native tribes about things that can wear your skin, things that move like people but aren't. The word skinwalker came up more than once. I don't know if that's what I saw. I don't want to know. I haven't camped alone since. Even now, when I go out with friends, I can't sleep unless there's a solid wall between me and the woods. I still dream about that thing standing up, turning its head slow like it already knew I was there. Not surprised, not afraid, just waiting. And sometimes when I drive out of town, I swear I see something in the trees just off the highway. Still, watching, quiet, waiting. I was 32 the year I went up to the ridge behind Black Elk Hollow in central Wyoming, not far from a dried-up riverbed we used to fish at when I was younger. It was mid-October 2014. The season had started early that year, and most of the hunters from town had already made their way back home after their first weekend out. I'd waited until the rush was over before heading up, partly because I hated running into other people in the woods, and partly because I preferred the quiet. I had a week off work, no cell service, and nobody waiting on me back in Riverton. It seemed like the right time to disappear into the timberline and clear my head. I packed up my old Ford pickup with what I needed. My Remington 700.30-06, my canvas tent, a couple gallons of water, 2 tarps, a cooler full of simple meals, a solar lantern, propane stove, and a pair of insulated boots I'd worn since college. I knew the land well enough not to bring a map, though I tossed an old one in the glove box just in case. I'd hunted this area since I was a kid with my uncle, back when he'd take me along and let me carry a BB gun just to feel grown. He died 3 years earlier, and I guess a part of me was trying to hold on to that memory, that version of me that hadn't yet been swallowed up by long shifts, missed calls, and bills stacked on the table. I got up there on a Monday morning, drove until the dirt trail narrowed and forced me to stop, and hiked the last mile to a flat spot near the ridge line. It wasn't a campsite, not officially, but there were signs someone had used it before. Burn marks where a fire pit had been, some rusted cans half buried in the soil. I pitched my tent under a set of lodgepole pines and hung a tarp between them to keep the dew off. The first evening was quiet. I spotted a few tracks not far from my tent. Elk, maybe a few days old. Nothing fresh. I didn't care. I wasn't in a rush to fill my tag. I sat on a log and watched the light fade over the tops of the trees, the kind of golden light you only see for 5 minutes a day, if you're lucky. Felt good to be out. No emails, no traffic, no people. Just cold wind and the sound of leaves scraping against each other like paper. That night, the wind picked up. It rattled the edge of my tarp and made the trees groan in that slow, twisting way. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. I wasn't nervous. I camped alone dozens of times. But there's something about being the only person for miles that makes your ears sharper. Every branch crack, every snap in the underbrush sounds different when you know it's not just a raccoon looking for food. The dark doesn't feel empty out there. It feels like it's holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard something heavier than the wind. A step, maybe two. Measured. Not an animal running, not a squirrel skittering. Just one step, then another. Close, then gone. I didn't move. I lay still, breathing slow, eyes wide open in the dark. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. In the morning, I climbed the ridge and glassed the valley. Fog hugged the lower trees, curling up the sides of the hill like smoke. I waited, watched, didn't see a thing. I found a set of elk tracks deeper down the slope, followed them for a couple miles, but they vanished in the undergrowth. I sat down on a fallen log to eat and rest my knees, then headed back to camp around mid-afternoon. It was quiet again, but something was off. The fire pit I'd set up was disturbed, just a little, like someone had brushed a foot against it. One of the stones I'd placed on the side was out of position. I'm not the kind of person who panics over little things, but I knew I hadn't done that. Still, I told myself maybe a squirrel had knocked it loose or the wind had shifted it. I made a small fire, cooked a can of beans, and tried to enjoy the dusk. That night, I heard it again, closer this time, crunching leaves. One set of slow, deliberate steps just past the edge of my tent. I didn't move. I listened. It sounded like someone circling, wide, careful. I reached for my rifle. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't make a sound. Then, nothing. Not a single footstep after that. Just silence. In the morning, I stepped out and checked the ground. There were faint boot prints. Not mine. I wear size 12s. These were smaller, narrower, like a size 9 or 10. Definitely a boot, though not a hiking shoe. I followed the tracks for about 30 yards until they vanished into harder ground. That was enough. I stood there for a minute and told myself to think. Could have been a hiker, someone else hunting. Maybe they didn't even see my camp. But something didn't sit right. The steps were too slow, too quiet, like they were sneaking. I thought about packing up. I should have, but I stayed. I don't know why. Pride, probably. I didn't want to be the guy who spooked himself into leaving the woods. I spent the day checking the area, keeping my rifle close. I didn't see anyone. No sign of movement, no noise, no other camps. I was alone again. That third night, I didn't sleep. I sat outside in the dark with the fire low, rifle across my knees, jacket zipped up tight. The wind was gone. It was dead still. That kind of stillness that makes the air feel thicker. Around 1 in the morning, I saw movement between the trees. A shape, upright, not an animal. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. It was a person. I couldn't see details, just the shape of them. Tall, thin, not walking toward me. Just standing, watching. I didn't call out. I didn't move the light. I just kept the fire dim and waited. After maybe a minute, the figure turned and stepped behind a tree. I stood up slow and waited. Nothing came out. No more movement. I kept my rifle up as I backed into my tent and zipped it, just enough to keep the wind out if it came. I didn't sleep that night either. To first light, I packed everything fast. I loaded my gear, collapsed the tent in a rush, stuffed it all in my pack without folding anything. I didn't even make coffee. I just wanted out. Halfway down the trail, I heard something again. Not behind me, off to the right, maybe 50 yards into the brush. I didn't see anything. I didn't stop. I kept moving, rifle in hand, breathing through my teeth. I didn't calm down until I saw my truck at the bottom of the trail, still there, untouched. I threw my pack in the bed, started the engine, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. Back in town, I filed a short report with the ranger's office. They didn't find anything. No other camps, no missing persons.
No illegal hunters.
Just empty woods. They told me sometimes transients wander that far out. Sometimes people don't want to be found. I didn't argue. I haven't been back to Black Elk Hollow since. That week changed the way I see the woods. It wasn't about fear, not exactly. It was about presence. Knowing someone was there, watching, waiting, not trying to scare me, not even trying to hurt me, just there, like a shadow that never fully leaves. I still hunt, I still camp, but I don't sleep as deeply anymore, not in the wild. I don't forget to check for prints near the fire pit. I don't brush off little things like stones moved an inch or two, because I know now somebody else might be out there. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a man. A quiet man who walks the woods at night, who doesn't leave a trace, and who never says a word. And that's what scares me more than anything else. It was early September 2017, and the heat was just starting to back off. I was 31 then, and things in my life were falling apart slowly, in ways I didn't even fully understand at the time. I just lost my job at a welding plant outside of Des Moines, and the silence that came with unemployment was starting to get to me. So when an old friend from high school, Danny, told me his uncle owned a patch of unused farmland out near Chariton, and that I could use it if I needed space to clear my head, I packed a tent, a cooler, and my old .22 rifle and headed down there. Danny gave me some rough directions to the property. It wasn't anything special, just about 70 acres of overgrown field and some trees near the back, with a collapsed barn and a dried-up cattle pond. The place hadn't been worked in years. He said the fence line was broken and the gate didn't even lock anymore, but no one would bother me out there. That was the idea. I needed isolation. I needed space to sit with my thoughts, even if I didn't like them. I drove my rusted-out Tacoma down a gravel road that looked like it hadn't been driven in weeks. The path to the actual camping spot was barely more than 2 tire ruts cutting through weeds waist-high. I pulled up next to what used to be a shed but was now just a skeleton of gray boards. The grass was flattened around a few old animal tracks, probably deer, maybe coyotes. I pitched my tent between 2 small trees near the edge of the tree line and set up my little fire pit with some dry sticks and logs I collected. The first night was uneventful. The crickets were loud, but that's what I wanted. No cars, no voices, just the sound of wind and bugs. I cooked some beans in a tin and drank a couple of beers before crawling into my sleeping bag. It got cold fast. I had a flashlight, but I didn't use it much. I preferred the dark. The second day, I walked around a bit. The fields were thick with tall weeds, mostly goldenrod and some kind of nettle that stung through my jeans. There were busted fence posts leaning at angles, some half swallowed by vines. I saw a small structure in the distance, might have been an old chicken coop or maybe a feed shack. It looked solid enough, so I walked out to it. The air around that shack smelled weird. Not rotting exactly, but stale and metallic. The door was missing, and inside it was just dirt and old boards. But there were scratch marks on the inside of the back wall. Real ones, not the kind animals make. These were long, straight grooves, deep enough that someone must have used a knife or something sharper. A bunch of them, too, all the same length, all starting about 3 feet off the ground. It made my skin crawl. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I told myself it didn't matter. Could have been anything. I headed back toward camp. That night, the wind picked up and I heard something moving in the tall grass past the trees. I figured it was deer. I didn't even get up, but it kept going, stopping and starting, like it was circling the tent. I turned on the flashlight and looked out. Nothing. Not even movement in the grass. No glowing eyes, no sound. Just the wind. I stayed up a long time listening. On the third day, I thought about heading back. I had enough space in my head, more than I wanted, really, but part of me didn't want to leave just yet. I kept thinking about those scratches. They kept nagging at me. I grabbed the rifle and headed back to that little shack. There was a smell this time worse than before. It was strong, almost like ammonia, but more sour. My throat tightened when I stepped inside. That's when I noticed something new. In the corner, behind some boards, there was a dead animal. At first I thought it was a coyote, but when I got closer, it looked off. Longer legs, strange posture. It was missing its front paws. Just raw stumps, dried black. There was no blood on the ground. It looked like it had been placed there. I backed out of the shack and walked fast back to my tent. I thought about packing everything up then and there. I really did, but I didn't. I stayed one more night. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to feel like I was running. Maybe I didn't want to admit something felt wrong. That last night was worse than the others. It was dead quiet. Even the crickets stopped. No wind, just stillness, like the air was heavy with something. I couldn't sleep, so I sat by the fire and kept the rifle close. Around 1 a.m., I heard something. Not walking, not moving through grass, just clicking, like something tapping on wood. I pointed the flashlight toward the trees. Nothing, but I knew something was out there. I could feel it, that thick feeling in my chest, like something was watching me. I stayed there till the fire burned out. Then I went in the tent, zipped it shut, and lay there holding the rifle tight, eyes wide open in the dark. Sometime just before dawn, I heard breathing, heavy, close, right outside the tent wall. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. It was slow and even, like whatever it was had been there a while and wasn't in a hurry. Then a single, slow scrape against the fabric of the tent. Just one, like a finger dragging from top to bottom. I held my breath. I didn't move, and then it stopped. I waited what felt like hours frozen in place. When the sun finally came up, I got out of that tent so fast I nearly ripped the zipper. There was nothing out there. No footprints, no signs of anything. But the weirdest thing, my cooler, which had been sealed and tucked under the fold-out table, was open. Every single piece of food was gone. The bag of jerky I'd sealed shut, the cheese sticks, even the little can of chili, all gone, without a mess, without any damage to the cooler itself. I packed up everything, threw it in the truck, and didn't even check behind me. The whole drive back I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, standing in the middle of the road behind me. But there was nothing. I never went back to that property. Danny asked me a couple months later if I'd ever ended up using it, and I just told him it wasn't for me. I didn't mention the shack or the animal or the sound outside the tent. I didn't even tell him about the breathing. That camping trip was supposed to give me peace, space to figure things out. But it did the opposite. It made everything worse. It showed me how thin the line really is between feeling safe and feeling hunted. Out there, miles from anyone, no phone signal, no backup, nothing. Something reminded me that I was small, soft, and blind in the dark. Whatever was out there that night wasn't a ghost. It wasn't magic. It was real, and it had been there long before I showed up. And I'm sure it's still out there. I took 2 weeks off work in late June 2019 to go camping alone in northern Idaho, around the Kaniksu National Forest. I was 29 that summer and needed the break. My job was draining me, and my apartment in Spokane felt like it was shrinking every month. I'd camped solo a few times before, always within a few hours of the city, but this time I wanted something more remote. I'd read about a few stretches of Forest Service roads near the Canadian border that were supposedly quiet, barely trafficked, and good for people who wanted to be left alone. That's exactly what I was after. I packed up my older blue Tacoma with my usual gear, a tent, stove, folding table, cot, my .22 rifle, and a few other essentials. I brought enough food and water to last at least 10 days if things went well. I didn't plan to hike far from the truck, maybe a mile or two at most, just enough to set up in a flat clearing, hopefully near some water. I wanted peace and nothing else. The drive took most of the day. Once I passed Sandpoint, the towns grew smaller and farther apart. By the time I reached the gravel roads deep in the forest, I hadn't seen another vehicle for almost an hour. No gas stations, no grocery stores, no cell service. That was the point, though. I followed a narrow road that climbed steadily uphill through the pines. There were pull-offs here and there, some just wide enough for a truck. Eventually, I found one that dipped slightly off the main road and opened up into a level spot ringed by thick trees. It looked like someone had camped there years ago. There was an old stone fire ring mostly buried in weeds and a rotting log someone had dragged over as a seat. It was a good spot, quiet, hidden, and far from anyone. The nearest house was probably 30 miles away. I set up camp quickly. The sun was still high, but I knew it would dip fast behind the trees. I pitched the tent close to the fire ring and built up the stones again. I laid out my cot inside and stacked my gear neatly in plastic bins. Once everything was sorted, I cracked open a beer, sat on the log, and watched the light fade through the trees. It was dead quiet. No cars, no people, not even a plane overhead. Just wind and birds. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No cars honking, no neighbors arguing. Just total stillness. The first 3 days passed uneventfully. I spent the mornings walking small trails near camp, just following the rise and fall of the land. I found a small stream about half a mile downhill and used it to wash up and cool off. I cooked simple meals, cans of beans, rice, eggs, coffee. I read in the sun, napped when I wanted, and sat for hours doing nothing at all. But on the 4th day, something changed. I woke up to find the folding chair I always left outside tipped over, like it had been knocked. At first I thought the wind did it, but nothing else was out of place. No animals had gotten into my food bins, and nothing was missing. It wasn't a big deal. I brushed it off and moved on. Later that day, while hiking past the stream, I spotted boot prints in the mud that weren't mine. They looked fresh. The soil was wet from the night before, and these tracks hadn't been there the day before. The boots looked smaller than mine, maybe size 9 or 10. I wear a 12. I stood there for a while, staring at the tracks. There were 4 or 5 prints going both ways, back and forth. Whoever it was hadn't just walked by, they had paced in that same spot. It was strange, but I reminded myself this was public land. Anyone could be out here, maybe a hunter or another camper. Still, I hadn't heard anything. No voices, no engines, no distant sounds at night. Whoever it was, they were moving quietly. That night, I kept the rifle closer to me inside the tent. I left no food out, zipped everything tight, and listened harder than usual before falling asleep. Again, the forest was silent. The next morning, I noticed something that made me stop cold. There was a piece of bark propped against the fire ring, almost like a little sign. It was shaped like a triangle and balanced carefully between 2 rocks. I hadn't put it there. I would have noticed it before. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't random either. Someone had placed it there. Someone had been at my camp while I slept. I walked a slow circle around my site, checking for more signs, boot prints, moved gear, anything. But the ground was dry and hard. I didn't see anything. The only change was that one piece of bark, and it felt worse than if something had been stolen. That day, I stayed close to camp. I kept the rifle out in the open and cooked early. I started a fire before the sun dipped and let it burn until long after dark. Every hour or so, I stood and scanned the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing, no movement.
No sounds.
But I could feel it. I wasn't alone anymore. The sixth day was when it got worse. I woke up and found my tent zipper partly open. Not wide, just 2 or 3 inches, but I always zipped it all the way down before I slept. Always. It wasn't torn. It wasn't jammed. Just slightly open, like someone had crouched there and looked in. That was it. I packed my gear in silence, skipping breakfast. I dumped the rest of my water on the fire pit and started loading the truck. That's when I saw the boot print near the driver's side door, perfectly shaped in the dust, clearer than the ones by the stream. Closer, too close. I froze, looked around. Nothing moved.
No breeze. No birds.
The air felt tight, like the forest was holding its breath. I climbed into the truck and turned the key. The engine kicked in without a problem, and I backed up, gravel crunching loud under the tires. I didn't stop. I didn't get out to double-check anything. I just drove. I made it about 6 miles down the forest road before I saw something ahead. An orange triangle nailed to a tree on the right side of the road. I hadn't seen it when I drove in. It was fresh. The bark was still wet around the nail. Someone had just put it up. I kept driving. My hands were sweating on the wheel, but I didn't stop. 10 more minutes down the road, I passed another sign. This time a piece of rope tied low around a tree trunk, almost like a snare. I swerved wide and kept going. I didn't relax until I hit pavement near the highway. Cell signal came back. I didn't even check my messages. I just kept driving south. I spent that night in a cheap motel outside Coeur d'Alene. The room smelled like mildew, but it had locks and lights and walls. I slept with the TV on, volume low, just enough noise to remind me I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. I didn't report it. What would I even say? No one stole anything. No one attacked me. Nothing actually happened. But something had been watching me. I'm sure of that. Someone followed me out there. They didn't want to hurt me right away. They wanted to be close, to watch, to get inside my tent. And they had all the time in the world. For a while, I thought about going back, just to prove I wasn't scared. But I never did. I sold most of my camping gear the next year. I told myself it was because I was too busy with work, that I didn't have time. But that wasn't the reason. Sometimes I still think about that triangle-shaped bark and the boot print by the truck. I still wonder how close they stood to me while I slept. I wonder what they would have done if I stayed one more night. I don't camp alone anymore, and I never will again. I went camping alone in the summer of 2014. I was 32 at the time and had just taken 2 weeks off work after a long stretch of overtime. I needed space, peace, and quiet, and the only place I ever really felt that kind of stillness was in the woods. So I drove out of Eugene, Oregon, toward the Umpqua National Forest and found a small, hidden trail that I'd seen on an old online hiking forum a couple years back. It was one of those places that didn't really exist on maps, just something you heard about through word of mouth or luck. The trail was narrow and covered with fallen branches. It looked like no one had hiked it in years. That's what made it perfect. I followed it for half a day, hauling my gear on my back. It was hard walking, uneven terrain, no signs, no markers, but I liked that. The thicker the trees grew around me, the better I felt. It was late afternoon by the time I found a flat clearing that looked perfect for camping. Just a small open patch surrounded by pines and firs. No other footprints.
No garby. No tire marks.
It felt untouched. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood, and got a small fire going. I didn't plan to cook much. I had a bag of dehydrated food packs and a little burner. After I ate, I sat by the fire with a small notepad, jotting down a few thoughts. I had no cell service, which was ideal. No buzzing, no updates, no nothing. Just wind through trees, crickets, and the occasional crack of a twig far off in the woods. It was after midnight when I finally crawled into my tent. The fire had burned down, and the air had gotten cooler. I zipped myself in, rolled into my sleeping bag, and fell asleep fast. The forest at night can be loud if you're not used to it, but I'd done this enough times to know which sounds to ignore. But something woke me up a couple of hours later. It wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. It was quiet, too quiet, like everything had stopped at once.
No bugs.
No wind, just a dead stillness outside. I stayed still in my bag for a minute or two, eyes wide open, ears straining. Then I heard something faint. Not an animal, not branches, something deliberate. Footsteps, very slow, soft but unmistakable. They came from the direction of the trail I'd hiked in on. I sat up inside my tent and listened. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath. Then I heard a new sound, like a long, low exhale. It didn't sound natural, more like someone letting out a breath after a long walk. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent or grab a light. I just sat there listening. Minutes passed. Nothing else came. Eventually, the bugs started up again. The trees rustled. Whatever it was gone or hiding. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay down but kept my knife close to my side and waited for the sky to turn gray. By morning, I was still unsure if what I heard was real or something half-dreamed. But when I stepped out of the tent, I found something that made me feel sick. There were footprints in the dirt about 15 feet away. They were not mine. Mine were heavy, from boots. These were barefoot, bare feet in the forest.
No sacks. No shoes.
Just a clear trail of human feet, coming from the tree line and stopping just before reaching my tent. Then nothing. No return trail. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the prints. They were adult-sized, wide, and dirty. I couldn't make sense of it. Why would someone be barefoot out here? Why walk toward my tent and then stop? I didn't eat breakfast. I packed my gear up fast. I thought about hiking back out, but something in me told me to wait, to watch, to be sure I wasn't being followed. I didn't want to get caught out on a trail with someone behind me I couldn't see. So I stayed another night. That second night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I tucked my tent deeper into the trees, under some brush, and covered it with a bit of camo tarp I kept for rainy days. I stayed inside as soon as the sun dipped low and kept completely silent. And again, I heard it. The same slow, soft steps. This time from a different direction, closer from the side. No exhale this time. Just walking. Then a pause. Then more walking. It circled me. Not close, but not far either. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. My whole body was stiff with fear. It went on like that for maybe 30 minutes. Then silence. Then again that strange sound. A slow breath. Or maybe a moan. Couldn't tell. The second morning, I found no new prints. It had rained slightly overnight, so the ground was soft, but no clear tracks. I figured either he'd kept his distance, or he'd learned to cover his steps. That was when I made my decision to leave. I couldn't stay another night. My gut was screaming at me that something was very wrong. I didn't even eat. I just took down the tent, packed, and started hiking out fast. Halfway down the trail, I stopped. There was something nailed to a tree. I thought I was imagining it at first. It was a strip of canvas, the same kind of material my tent was made of. A piece had been torn and tacked to a trunk with what looked like a sharp stick driven into the wood. There was a smear on it, a brown-red stain. It looked like old blood. That wasn't mine. I left it and kept moving. I didn't stop again. I didn't drink water. I didn't look back. I made it back to my car by late afternoon and drove without resting until I was deep into the suburbs. where I finally stopped at a gas station and sat in the lot for almost 30 minutes trying to calm down. I never reported anything. I didn't have anything to report, really. No one touched me. Nothing was stolen. I wasn't attacked. But I know what I heard. And I know someone was there. Someone barefoot, circling my camp, breathing heavily in the dark. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. I still think about the quiet that fell that first night, that unnatural stillness, that moment when everything in the woods just stopped like it was holding its breath. Whatever was out there, it knew I was alone, and it wanted me to know I wasn't alone. That's the part that keeps me up sometimes, that whoever it was didn't try to hide. They wanted me to hear them, to find those prints, to see the strip of my tent nailed to a tree, like it was a message. They'd done it before. They knew what they were doing. That's why they were barefoot. That's why they were quiet. That's why they didn't rush it. They were patient. And if I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I'd have made it back. I was 34 when I flew out to Brazil for what I thought would be a solo camping trip deep in the Amazon rainforest. I had taken a sabbatical from work, and I needed space. Life had become too predictable, too clean, too safe. I wanted something real, something that could remind me I was alive. I'd done plenty of backpacking and rough camping before, mostly in the Rockies and out in Borneo once when I was younger, but never anything like this. The Amazon was a different world altogether. I arrived in Manaus in early June 2019, stayed a couple of nights at a cheap guest house near the port, and bought supplies from a local outdoor shop. I also paid a local boatman, guy named Eduardo, to take me upriver and drop me off at a remote location west of the Rio Negro. We agreed he'd come back in 5 days to pick me up. I gave him extra cash just to make sure he would. That's how I found myself alone, standing beside the edge of the river as his small boat disappeared into the trees, the sound of the engine swallowed by the jungle. My backpack had enough food, water purification tablets, machete, solar charger, tent, medical kit. I knew the basics. I had mapped out a circular route that would bring me back to the same riverbank 5 days later. I wasn't going too deep. That was the plan anyway. The first night was hot, sticky, and loud. The jungle never shuts up. It creaks and chirps and rustles in 1,000 layers. I didn't sleep well, just laid in my hammock and listened, every sound amplified by the darkness. I wasn't afraid yet, just alert. The next day, I made it about 7 kilometers west. Progress was slow. The ground was soaked in many places. My boots were constantly sinking into mud or catching on roots. I stopped at midday to boil some water, ate a few protein bars, and moved again until late afternoon. Around 4, I found a higher patch of ground under a thick canopy. That night, I pitched my tent and gathered some dry branches for a small fire. I didn't like sleeping in the hammock when I was this deep out. The tent made me feel more grounded. It was on the 3rd day that things shifted. I had veered slightly off the plan to avoid a steep ravine that hadn't shown up on the satellite map. I tried to go around it, but ended up heading northwest instead of west. I noticed when the sun was already dropping lower than I expected. I pulled out the GPS tracker, but the signal was weak, and the screen kept freezing. I kept walking anyway. The terrain was denser now, and the undergrowth thicker. I had to push through tangled vines and sidestep massive tree roots like walls rising out of the forest floor. That's when I smelled something. At first, I thought it was just the usual rotting plant matter. The jungle always smells a bit like decay, but this was different, sharper, thicker. It clung to the back of my throat. A few more steps and I noticed a cluster of black flies swarming near the base of a tree about 20 meters off to my right. I stopped walking. Something was over there. I don't know what made me step off the trail. Curiosity, maybe, or just the instinct to make sense of whatever felt wrong. I moved carefully, machete in hand, pushing through the brush. The flies grew louder. The smell got worse. And then I saw it. A body, face down, half covered in a torn green tarp and surrounded by empty cans and wrappers. The skin had gone grayish, bloated, and was starting to peel in places. I couldn't see the face. The back of the head was swollen, almost black from decomposition. The arms were stiff. One boot had come off and lay a few feet away, mold already forming on the leather. I froze. My heart started pounding, not in fear at first, but in disbelief. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't some story I'd read. It was real. A real human body, left here and forgotten in the middle of the rainforest. I stepped back and looked around. There were signs of a small camp, collapsed tent,
a rusty pot,
a cracked plastic bottle filled with brown water, some pages from a notebook stuck under a rock, but most of the writing had run from the rain. One page had a date, May 18th, 2019. It was June 12th when I found him. Whoever this was had been dead at least a couple of weeks. My thoughts began racing. I had no radio. The GPS was unreliable. I had no way to notify anyone until I got back to the river where Eduardo was supposed to pick me up in 2 days. I took out my phone and took a few pictures of the scene, just enough for authorities to recognize it. I didn't touch the body. I didn't go through his things. Still, I didn't want to camp anywhere near it. I backtracked about half a kilometer and found a slightly raised clearing. That night, I barely slept. The jungle felt different now, meaner, more hostile. The sounds seemed sharper, as if something out there was disturbed. I kept thinking about who the man was, how he ended up out here, and why nobody had come for him. Did he get lost? Did he run out of supplies? Was he traveling alone like me? But what if he wasn't alone? That thought wouldn't leave me. Maybe someone left him there. Maybe there was a reason he was hidden under a tarp. Maybe someone didn't want him found. I got moving early the next morning. I barely ate, just filled my water, shoved everything into my pack, and moved fast, checking my compass and trying to find the route back to the river. I didn't want to be in that forest a second longer than necessary. It took me nearly 10 hours to reach the riverbank. I got there just before sunset. My legs were shaking, and my clothes were soaked through with sweat and mud. I sat down right by the water's edge, machete across my lap, eyes on the trees. I kept hearing things, cracks, movement, but I saw nothing. Eduardo didn't show up the next morning. I waited 6 hours before I saw his boat coming around the bend. I stood there, arm raised. I didn't relax until I climbed inside the boat and we were moving again. I didn't say much. I just told him there was something back there he needed to report to the local police. A dead body. I gave him the coordinates I had marked and showed him the photos. He looked at me for a long second and nodded. Back in Manaus, I went straight to the Policia Federal and reported everything. They took my statement, copied the photos, and asked a few questions. I gave them the notebook page I had taken and the coordinates again. They didn't seem surprised. One officer told me offhand that it wasn't the first time a foreigner had gone missing out there. I flew home 2 days later. I still think about that body sometimes. Not just the sight of it, but the silence around it. The way the forest had tried to cover it up. The way nobody had come looking. The jungle doesn't care. It grows over everything, alive and rotting at the same time. And if I hadn't gone off track that day, I never would have seen him. It made me realize how easy it is to vanish in a place like that. How someone could die out there and never be found. Not because of any creature or monster or curse. Just because of bad luck, bad planning, or worse, another person. I don't think I'll go back. That trip gave me what I was looking for. Something real. Something that reminded me I was alive. But it also reminded me how close we all are to disappearing. I went camping in northern Arizona in the fall of 2013. I was 28 at the time. I had driven out from Albuquerque to spend a few quiet days off-grid. I had taken a few solo camping trips over the years, and this one felt right. I needed to be away from everything: phone, work, traffic. My plan was to stay out for 3 nights, maybe 4 if the weather stayed good. I picked a spot in the Kaibab National Forest, far from the more popular trails. I'd been there once before with a friend a couple of years earlier. There were no official campsites where I went, just flat earth and trees. The nearest trailhead was maybe a mile and a half back, and even that was just a gravel pull-off. I liked the silence. I liked the feeling of being completely on my own. The first day went fine. I spent the afternoon setting up my tent, collecting wood, and organizing my gear. I kept it simple: just one pot, a gas burner, a sleeping pad, and a tarp I always strung between trees just in case it rained. I had brought a small hatchet, a hunting knife, and a revolver. Not because I expected trouble, just because I always did. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up through the thin mesh of the tent at the stars. It got cold after midnight, but nothing unusual. A few wind gusts, a few creaks from the forest, the usual sounds. It was the second night when things started to feel off. I had been walking most of the day, just wandering with a compass and a basic map, not really aiming for anything. I saw a few deer in the distance, 1 elk, and lots of birds. By the time I got back to camp, it was past 5. The shadows were long. I cooked, ate, and cleaned up quick. I never left food out. Not because I feared bears, there were hardly any reports in that part of Arizona, but because it was habit. I remember sitting near the fire around 7 p.m. I was sharpening the edge of my knife with a small steel rod. The air was quiet, completely still. That was the first thing I noticed. Not even a breeze. No crickets either. No bird calls. Just the sound of the blade scraping metal. I looked out toward the tree line. Nothing. The sun had just dipped, and a purple glow lingered on the western horizon. I got the feeling something was nearby. Not the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, but something deeper. It was like a cold knot just below my ribs. I stood up and listened. I stayed like that for at least 5 minutes, still ears straining, just scanning the trees. I heard one soft crunch, just one, like a foot or a paw pressing into old leaves. It came from the north, maybe 50 or 60 feet into the woods. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I got my flashlight and scanned the woods. I kept the beam low and slow. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected back. I stood there for a long time, just pointing the light into the dark. Eventually, I sat back down. The fire had burned low, so I fed it more wood and made sure the revolver was close. I didn't feel like sharpening the knife anymore. I just stared into the flames and listened. The silence stayed. Felt unnatural, too complete. I've been in quiet woods before, but this wasn't that. This felt like something was holding its breath. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up every hour or so. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the tent fabric, but when I sat up and listened, I heard nothing. I told myself it was the wind, even though there hadn't been any. I kept the revolver under my sleeping bag and the knife in my boot. The third day, I tried to act normal. I hiked, collected more wood, refilled my water at a nearby stream, and forced myself to stay out longer than I normally would. But I was on edge. Every squirrel darting through brush made me twitch. I stopped every couple hundred yards to scan the trees. That evening, around 6:30, I saw something. I had just returned from the stream and was walking the last 30 yards toward camp. I had to pass through a small slope of pine trees to get there. As I moved up the slope, I looked up and stopped. Something moved behind my tarp. Just a quick shape, like someone slipping behind it. I froze. My mind went blank. For a second, I doubted myself. Then I drew the revolver. I took slow steps forward. I called out. Didn't say anything, just made a loud sound. Nothing. The tarp barely moved. I got closer and swung the flashlight around the trees. Nothing. I stepped around the tarp. No one there, but something had definitely brushed it. The bottom edge of the fabric was still slightly swaying, like something had passed too close. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat upright by the fire, wrapped in my coat, revolver across my lap. Around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like breathing. Not loud, not raspy, just soft, slow breathing, maybe 20 feet away in the trees. But I couldn't see a thing. I pointed the flashlight into the woods, but the battery had started to dim. The beam barely reached. The breathing stopped after a few minutes. I never saw anything. Right before dawn, I packed everything up. Tent, tarp, gear, everything. I didn't cook breakfast. I didn't refill water. I just crammed it all into my pack and hiked out. I made it to my truck by 9 a.m. and got the hell out of there. A few days later, back in Albuquerque, I was still trying to make sense of it. I talked myself into believing it was just some animal. Maybe a coyote, maybe a cougar. They're quiet and smart. I tried to believe that. I really did. But something didn't sit right. The way it moved behind the tarp. The breathing. The perfect silence that fell before each time it came near. And the prints. I hadn't noticed them at the time, but they were in a photo I'd taken of the fire ring the first morning. I had crouched low to snap a picture of the coals and the woods behind it. Just a personal memory. I only looked at that photo a week later. In the corner of the frame, just on the edge of the tent shadow, were two prints. Not boots, not bare feet either. Just odd, wide marks. The spacing didn't make sense. Too far apart to be from a small animal, but not deep enough for a heavy one. I stared at that picture for a long time. I still have it. I never show it to anyone. Not because I think it proves anything, but because I know what I felt when I took it. That first morning, before anything had gone wrong. That image came from a time when I thought I was alone in those woods. I haven't been camping since, and I won't ever go alone again. I was 32 when I decided to take a solo camping trip across part of northern England. Not far from the Lake District, but far enough out that there weren't many hikers or tourists around. This was in late September 2019. The weather was already starting to turn damp and chilly, and that helped keep the crowds away too. I wanted quiet. I'd been dealing with stress at work and just needed to step away for a while. I picked a small patch of forestland near a disused rail line just outside a village called Tarnbrook. It wasn't completely wild, but it was the sort of place that didn't get much foot traffic anymore. You could still see the outline of where the old railway tracks used to run. The stone bridge that once went over it had half collapsed years ago, and moss covered everything. It was silent except for wind and crows most of the time. I parked my car about 2 miles away near a gravel lay-by and hiked the rest of the way in. I had my rucksack, tent, water, food, and a small hatchet for chopping firewood. Nothing fancy. I brought a book too and had my phone, but the signal was spotty at best. That was the point. I just wanted to disappear into the trees for a few days and come back feeling like my head had cleared. The first night was quiet. Just wind pushing through the trees and the occasional sound of something small scuttling through the underbrush. The temperature dipped down lower than I expected, and I remember waking up around 2 a.m. shivering even though I'd packed a decent sleeping bag. I got up, stoked the fire a little, warmed my hands, then zipped back in. The second day I wandered around more, trying to find where the old rail line disappeared behind a wall of overgrowth. I didn't find much, just more fallen trees and some cracked stone that might have been a foundation or an old shed long gone. I didn't think much about it. It was peaceful out there, and the air smelled like wet bark and pine. That night, it started to rain lightly. I stayed mostly dry inside the tent, but I didn't sleep as well. Rain pattering on nylon has a rhythm to it that can either knock you out cold or keep your brain stuck in loops. For me, it was the latter. I kept drifting in and out until just past 4 a.m. That's when I heard the sound. It wasn't loud, but it was wrong. Like heavy footsteps, slow, pressing down on wet leaves. It didn't match the rhythm of any animal I knew. Not a deer, not a fox. It was human. I didn't move. I just lay there with my ears fully awake and my body stiff as a board. The steps weren't close, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, but they were distinct. And then they stopped. I waited for a long time, maybe an hour. I couldn't hear anything else, not even wind. Eventually, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks and went back to sleep. In the morning, the forest looked normal. No signs of anything. I walked around the area, looked for prints in the wet soil, and found nothing obvious. I convinced myself it had been a branch falling or some kind of illusion caused by being overtired. That third evening, I built the fire early and stayed up beside it longer than usual. There was a weird feeling in my chest, something like unease but without any clear reason for it. I kept scanning the trees. Sometimes I thought I saw something move between the branches, but every time I stared, there was nothing. I stayed up until just past midnight, then doused the fire and climbed into the tent. I left the zipper slightly undone near the bottom for airflow, like I always do. It wasn't long before I dozed off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up again, but it was still pitch dark. My breath fogged in front of me and the air felt colder than before. I lay there for a moment trying to fall back asleep. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time closer. Crunch, crunch. It wasn't an animal. I didn't move. I just focused my ears. Whoever it was, they were walking around my tent slowly, one full circle, like they were inspecting it. No light, no sounds besides the steps. At one point, the shadow of their legs moved right across the fabric wall of the tent. I could see them through the dim moonlight leaking in. They just stood there. I held my breath. No sound came from them. No talking. No sniffing like a dog or grunting or coughing. Just silence and that dark shape outside my tent. Then the legs shifted and the shadow disappeared. For maybe another minute, I heard the steps again. They wandered off into the woods. Then nothing. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there until the sky lightened. When morning finally came, I got out of the tent and looked around. I found one boot print in the mud, right near the spot where the shape had stood. Deep heel, shallow toe, like whoever it was had been leaning back while standing there. I followed the direction the steps had gone, but they disappeared not far into the trees. No trail, no other signs. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I hesitated. I tried to convince myself again that it was just some weird hiker, someone who got lost or maybe curious. But what kind of person walks up to a stranger's tent in the middle of nowhere, circles it, and then vanishes? That last night, I didn't light a fire. I thought maybe if I kept things dark and quiet, whoever it was wouldn't come back. I lay in the tent with my hatchet beside me, barely blinking. I kept the rain cover pulled back so I could see out through the mesh if I needed to. The sky was clear and full of stars. Around 3 a.m., I saw him. He wasn't walking this time. He was standing dead still between two trees maybe 15 meters away. Just there, facing my tent. He didn't move for at least 10 minutes, just watching. Then he stepped behind a tree and didn't come out the other side. I waited for hours. At first light, I got up, packed everything as fast as I could, and left. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't even fold the tent properly. I just shoved it into the bag. I hiked straight back to the car, kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. When I got to the car, there was mud on the driver's side door. A smear of it, like a hand had been pressed there. I checked the windows. Nothing was broken. The doors were still locked. I opened the boot, shoved everything in, and drove. I never went back to Tarnbrook after that. I don't even like looking at forests anymore. The thought of trees lining both sides of a path, with shadows just beyond reach, it makes my skin crawl now. I still don't know who he was. Could have been a local, a drifter, someone who lived off-grid nearby. Or maybe someone who saw my car parked by the road and followed me. The idea that he might have been watching from the first night and I never noticed, it gets under my skin even now. But I'm sure of one thing. That man wasn't lost. He wasn't trying to find help or curious about a camper. He stood out there in the dark and just watched. Calm, still, not making a sound. And that's what scares me most. People don't do that unless they're thinking something very bad.